The desert smelled of iron and dust. In the year of our Lord 1892, the sun over the Arizona territory was a merciless sovereign, and the town of Copper Bend was its scorched, supplicant subject. The wind, when it bothered to move at all, did nothing to cool the air. It was a hot breath that simply stirred the red dust, lifting it from the cracked earth to coat the unpainted planks of the buildings, to settle in the lungs of man and beast, to grit between the teeth. The sky was not blue but a hard, metallic sheet, reflecting the glare until the eyes ached. Martha Green felt the heat through the worn soles of her shoes. At 26 years of age, she was a widow, a fact that felt as distant and strange as the green hills of Ohio she had left behind. Her husband, a good man with a miner's cough and a dreamer's heart, had been taken by a fever 2 winters past, leaving her with little more than his name and a small, quiet room at the back of the boarding house. She survived. That was the word for it. Not lived, but survived. She taught reading and sums to the handful of children whose parents saw value in such things, and she mended clothes for prospectors and cowboys, her fingers nimble and sure as she stitched denim worn thin by saddle and stone. The pay for such work was meager, a few coins here and there that were spent on flour and beans before they had time to warm her pocket. She was a woman of high self-regard, a fact that was both her shield and her heaviest burden. It kept her from begging when her stomach twisted with a hunger so sharp it felt like a blade. It was what kept her dress clean and her back straight, even as she walked through the main street of Copper Bend, a ghost in a town that barely noticed her. Today, the hunger was a living thing inside her, a gnawing creature that left her lightheaded and trembling. She had not eaten since the morning prior, and the small heel of bread she'd had then was a faint memory. Her gaze drifted over the town, a collection of tired structures huddled together as if for comfort against the vast, indifferent landscape. The saloon was already loud with the day's first drinkers. The steeple of the new church, paid for by a rancher's sudden conscience, pointed a finger of pale, splintering wood at the unforgiving sky. The sheriff's office looked sleepy and permanent, and there, in the middle of it all, was McCall General Store, the heart and soul of commerce in Copper Bend. It was where you bought everything from nails to sugar, from bullets to bolts of calico. It was where you bought food. Clutched in her right hand, hidden in the folds of her skirt, was the last thing of value she owned. It was a simple gold band, worn smooth with time. It had been her mother's wedding ring. Her own had been sold a year ago to pay for the doctor and the coffin. But this one, her mother's, this was the last link to a life before this one. A life of soft rain and green grass and a mother's gentle hand. It was a memory made solid, a circle of gold that held the ghost of a promise. To sell it felt like a betrayal deeper than she could fathom. It felt like selling her own bones. But the gnawing in her belly was relentless. Pride, she was learning, was a poor substitute for bread. Across the street, a man leaned against the wall of the smithy, watching the town with an unnerving stillness. Eli Turner. He was 32, a cowboy who worked out at the Miller Horse Ranch. He was a quiet man, one who spoke so seldom that when he did, his voice was a rusty surprise. He had the look of a man who had seen too much of the world and had found it wanting. The lines around his eyes were etched deep, not from laughter but from squinting into the sun and perhaps into a past no one in Copper Bend knew much about. Rumor said he had been a soldier in the Great War between the states. But on which side? No one could say for certain. He carried himself with a coiled tension, a watchfulness that never seemed to leave him. His gaze was steady and gray, and it missed nothing. Martha felt it on her sometimes, a silent, assessing look that made her feel both seen and completely invisible. She pulled her shawl tighter despite the heat and turned her face away, taking a deep, unsteady breath that tasted of dust. She pushed open the door to the McCall General Store. The bell above the door gave a tired jingle. The air inside was cooler, thick with the scents of coffee beans, cured leather, and pickle brine. It was a smell of plenty, a smell that made the emptiness in her stomach ache with a fresh, sharp pang. Mr. McCall sat on a high stool behind the counter, a portly man with a fringe of gray hair and small, shrewd eyes that seemed to be constantly calculating profit and loss. He was polishing a pair of spectacles with a scrap of flannel and did not look up immediately. He let his customers wait. It was part of his power. "Afternoon, Mrs. Green," he said finally, hooking the spectacles behind his ears. His voice was oily with false politeness. "Come for some thread." Martha's throat was dry. She walked to the counter, her steps feeling loud and clumsy in the quiet store. She could feel the weight of Eli Turner's silent presence across the street, as if he were watching her even through the thick glass of the storefront window. She forced herself to meet McCall's gaze. "No, Mr. McCall, not today." She opened her hand and placed the small gold band on the polished wood of the counter. It looked small and vulnerable there, a tiny circle of light in the dim store. I need to sell this." McCall picked up the ring, holding it between his thick thumb and forefinger. He brought it close to his eye, squinting. The silence stretched, filled only by the buzzing of a fat fly near a barrel of molasses. "Gold," he grunted, as if making a grand discovery. He dropped it on the counter. It made a small, sad sound. Not much of it, thin. "It was my mother's," Martha said, her voice barely a whisper. The words were a plea, though she did not know what she was pleading for. Respect, perhaps. Acknowledgement that this was more than just a piece of metal. McCall chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "A mother's love don't add to the weight. Mrs. Green, I'll give you $1 for it." $1. A single silver dollar. It would buy a few loaves of bread, maybe some salt pork. It would keep her alive for a few more days, and then she would be right back where she started. Only without the last piece of her past. The injustice of it was a hot, bitter taste in her mouth. "Mr. McCall, please," she said, hating the weakness in her own voice. "It is worth more than that. You know it is." "Is it?" he countered, leaning forward, his small eyes gleaming. "Value is what a man is willing to pay. And right now, you look like a woman who cannot afford to bargain. You are hungry. I imagine $1 buys bread. Seems like a fair trade to me. A bit of gold for a full belly. A gift, you might even say." His words were a physical blow, stripping away the last of her dignity. He was not just buying a ring. He was buying her humiliation and enjoying the transaction. He saw her desperation and named it charity, a cruel twist of the knife. Something inside her, a core of hard, unyielding pride she thought hunger might have finally dissolved, snapped into place. Her back straightened, her chin lifted. She looked him square in the eye, her own gaze clear and cold. "No, thank you, Mr. McCall. I find your price lacking, and I do not accept charity." She reached out and curled her fingers around the ring, snatching it from the counter. Her hand was trembling, but her voice was steady. She turned without another word and walked toward the door, her head held high. The shame was a fire in her cheeks, but it was now mixed with the cold, clean feeling of defiance. She had not surrendered. As she stepped back out into the blinding, oppressive heat, the bell on the door announced her departure with a mocking little jingle. The sudden shift from the dim interior to the brilliant glare of the sun made her dizzy. The world swam for a moment, a blur of red earth and white-hot sky. She took a faltering step, trying to clear her head, to push back the encroaching blackness at the edge of her vision. The hunger, sharpened by the confrontation, was a physical pain now, a fist clenching deep inside her. Her palm was slick with sweat, and in that moment of weakness, of dizzy disorientation, her fingers lost their purchase. The little gold ring, her mother's ring, slipped from her grasp. She made a small, choked sound of dismay. She watched, helpless, as it fell. It hit the dusty street with a soft puff, bounced once, and then began to roll. It spun away from her, a tiny, gleaming circle gathering red dust as it went, rolling on an inexorable path across the main street. It seemed to roll for an eternity, a slow-motion tragedy under the vast, silent sky. And then it stopped. It came to rest directly against the toe of a scuffed, dusty boot. Martha's breath caught in her throat. Her gaze traveled slowly upward from the boot, up a pair of denim-clad legs, past a plain leather belt, over a faded blue shirt, to the face of the man who wore them. It was Eli Turner. He had moved from his spot by the smithy and now stood in the middle of the street, as still and silent as a figure carved from stone. He had seen it all. The way he looked at her now, there was no pity in his eyes. There was no judgment. There was only a profound and unsettling stillness, a gray-eyed calm that seemed to absorb the heat, the dust, the whole desperate scene, and give nothing back. He did not speak. He simply held her gaze for a long moment. Then, his eyes dropped to the small gold ring lying in the dust at his feet. The world seemed to shrink to that single point, the proud, hungry woman, the silent, watchful cowboy, and the circle of gold that lay between them in the red Arizona dirt. For a long moment that stretched thin under the oppressive weight of the sun, they remained frozen. Martha felt the blood drain from her face, a wave of cold shock that left her dizzy and nauseated. She could not move, could not breathe, could only stare at the man and the small, dusty circle of gold that separated them. The entire town, the entire world, seemed to have fallen away, leaving only this silent, humiliating tableau in the middle of the street. Eli Turner did not stoop to meet her gaze. His expression remained unreadable, a mask of sun-weathered calm. He held her eyes for a heartbeat longer, then slowly, deliberately, he bent at the knees. His movements were fluid and economical, without hurry. He pinched the ring between his thumb and forefinger, lifting it from the red dirt. He did not brush it off. He did not look at it. He simply closed his hand around it, straightened up, and without a single glance in her direction, he turned and walked toward the McCall General Store. The bell above the door announced his entrance with the same tired jingle that had mocked her exit. Martha was left alone in the street, the dust settling around her feet. The emptiness in her hand was a cold, aching void. She felt stripped bare, as if he had not just taken the ring but had taken the last shred of her privacy, the last secret of her desperation. A carriage rumbled past, the driver tipping his hat without seeing the invisible drama that had just unfolded. The world moved on. Mortification, hot and sharp, finally broke her paralysis. She turned and fled, not looking back, her quick, stumbling steps carrying her away from the center of town, away from those gray, knowing eyes, back to the stifling silence of her small room. Inside the store, the air was still cool. "Mister?" McCall looked up from his ledger, a smirk playing on his lips as Eli Turner approached the counter. He had seen the whole pathetic display through the front window. "Well now, Turner," McCall began, his voice oozing condescension. "Come for a bit of entertainment. Have you some women provide more sport than a horse race? And for a good deal less." Eli did not respond to the jibe. He opened his calloused hand and placed the dusty gold ring on the polished counter. It looked just as small and lost as it had when Martha had placed it there. "The ring," Eli said. His voice was low and even, like stones rubbing together at the bottom of a river. "The one the lady dropped." McCall's smirk widened. He poked the ring with a fat finger. "That one, she is a gust of wind away from begging on the street. A woman like that would sell her own shadow for a meal. I offered her $1. Generous, I thought, for her situation." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Between us, I would have gotten it for 50 cents if she had not gotten her back up. Eli's face did not change. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, remained fixed on McCall. He reached into the pocket of his denim trousers and pulled out a single, heavy coin. It was not silver. It was a $10 gold piece. He set it on the counter next to the ring. The sound it made was solid, final. "I will take it," Eli said. McCall stared at the gold piece. His jaw went slack, the smirk vanishing as if wiped away by a cloth. $10 for a sliver of worn gold that was worth $2, maybe $3 at most. His shrewd little eyes darted from the coin to Eli's impassive face, searching for the angle, the trick. He found nothing, only the quiet, unblinking gaze of a man who was not bargaining. "Sold," McCall squeaked, his hand snatching the coin from the counter before Eli could change his mind. He scooped the ring and the gold piece into his palm, a flicker of pure, unadulterated greed lighting his face. He started to turn toward the cash box. "Wait," Eli said. The word was not loud, but it stopped McCall cold. Eli's gaze lifted from the counter and began to travel slowly around the store. He looked at the shelves packed with tinned goods, the sacks of flour and sugar stacked against the far wall, the barrels of nails and pickles, the bolts of fabric, the glass jars of penny candy. His eyes took in everything, missing nothing. He was not browsing. He was taking inventory. When his gaze returned to McCall, it was as steady and direct as before. "What is the price for the whole thing?" McCall blinked. He must have misheard. The whole thing? You mean the whole stock of licorice whips?" He chuckled weakly, trying to make a joke of it. "The store," Eli clarified, his voice flat. "The stock, the building, the name on the sign, everything. What is your price?" The storekeeper stared at him now, truly bewildered. This was not a joke. The cowboy was as serious as a heart attack. A wild, impossible idea began to spark in McCall's mind. The man was either mad or impossibly rich. In either case, there was profit to be made, a great deal of profit. He licked his dry lips, his mind racing, calculating years of earnings, the value of the land, the cost of his own sweat, and then adding a generous measure for sheer, audacious opportunity. $2,000, McCall said, the number tasting like a fantasy on his tongue. It was an absurd price, nearly double what the place was worth. He set it as a challenge, expecting to be laughed out of his own establishment. Eli Turner did not laugh. He did not even blink. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "I will be back with the bank draft before they close." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving the storekeeper standing behind his counter, trembling slightly, with a $10 gold piece in his hand and the ghost of a $2,000 fortune ringing in his ears. The world had just tilted on its axis. Meanwhile, in her rented room, Martha paced the 3 steps from the bed to the wall and back again. The defiance that had carried her from the store had long since burned away, leaving behind the cold, gray ash of despair. Hunger was no longer a creature. It was a flood, a tide of weakness and pain that threatened to pull her under. She saw her mother's face in her mind, heard her gentle voice, and the shame was a physical agony. She had lost the last piece of her. She had let it roll away into the dirt for a stranger to claim. But the body had its own will, its own relentless demands. Pride could not be eaten. Honor could not fill a stomach. The memory of McCall's offer, as insulting as it was, now seemed like a lifeline she had foolishly cast aside. $1. $1 for a few more days of survival. Her resolve crumbled. Humiliation was a bitter pill, but starvation was a slow and certain death. With a heart as heavy as lead, she made her decision. She smoothed her dress, pinned a stray strand of hair back into its tight bun, and prepared to walk the longest, most difficult road of her life. The few hundred yards back to the general store to beg for the pittance she had earlier refused. The walk was an ordeal. Every person she passed seemed to be looking at her, whispering. She imagined the story was already making the rounds. The proud widow brought low. She kept her eyes fixed on the wooden planks of the walkway, her face a pale, tight mask. When she reached the store, she hesitated for a full minute, her hand hovering over the door. Taking a ragged breath, she pushed it open. The scene inside stopped her in the doorway. Mr. McCall was nowhere to be seen. Instead, Eli Turner stood behind the counter. He had taken off his hat, revealing a thatch of dark, unruly hair. His sleeves were rolled up to his forearms, and he was methodically stacking tins of peaches into a neat pyramid. He moved with the same quiet efficiency with which he did everything. The store felt different, the air less stale, as if a window had been opened somewhere. He must have heard the bell, but he did not look up immediately. He placed one last tin on the top of the stack before he turned his head and looked at her. His gray eyes held hers. Martha's carefully rehearsed words died in her throat. Her plan had been to find McCall, to speak to him alone, to get the wretched business over with. The presence of this silent cowboy threw her into complete confusion. "Mr. Turner," she managed, her voice thin and unsteady. I came back to speak with Mr. McCall." Eli wiped his hands on a rag that lay on the counter. He did not say that McCall was gone, that he had sold the store and was likely halfway to the saloon to celebrate his sudden fortune. He simply turned and reached under the counter. When he turned back, he held a brown paper parcel tied with twine. From the shape and smell, it was a loaf of fresh bread, a wedge of cheese, and perhaps some dried beef. He placed the parcel gently on the counter. Then, from his shirt pocket, he produced the small gold ring. He laid it next to the food. It was clean now, the red dust wiped away, its soft gold gleaming in the dim light. He looked at her, his face giving away nothing of his thoughts. The silence in the store was absolute. Then he spoke, his voice low and devoid of any discernible emotion. "Keep the gold, and stay." Martha stared at him, then at the items on the counter. The words made no sense. They were a riddle, a puzzle she could not begin to solve. Keep the gold, the ring was his. He had paid $10 for it. And stay where? Why, a terrible thought began to form in her mind. This was a performance, a grand, cruel gesture designed to underscore her poverty, to make a spectacle of her need. He had witnessed her humiliation and had decided to amplify it, to turn her quiet desperation into a public drama with himself as the mysterious benefactor. The kindness was so vast, so inexplicable, that it could only be a form of mockery. "I do not understand you, sir," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of confusion and rising anger. He offered no explanation. He simply held her gaze for another long moment, as if waiting for something to dawn on her. When it did not, he seemed to accept it. He picked up his hat from the counter, settled it on his head, and walked around the end of the counter. He passed her without a word and went out the door, letting it swing shut behind him. She was left alone in the store that was no longer McCall's, with a parcel of food she had not bought and a ring that was not hers. The act was so bizarre, so utterly incomprehensible, that it felt like a blow. She felt her name, her very identity, being rewritten by this silent man. She was no longer just the poor widow. She was now the subject of this man's inexplicable charity, a woman to be pitied and provided for like a stray cat. The humiliation was more profound than anything she had felt before. She could not touch the food. She could not touch the ring. She turned and fled the store for the second time that day, the kindness feeling more like a brand on her soul than a gift. She did not get far before the whispers reached her. The news had indeed spread through Copper Bend with the speed of a prairie fire. The bank teller had confirmed it. The lawyer who drew up the deed had told his wife. Eli Turner, the quiet cowboy from the Miller Ranch, had bought the general store, and he had done it right after buying a poor widow's ring for 10 times its worth. The conclusion was immediate and unanimous. The fool cowboy bought the entire store just for a woman. She heard it from a pair of ladies gossiping near the mercantile. Lost his senses completely. A man chuckled, leaning against the saloon doors. That is the most expensive piece of affection I have ever seen purchased. Every eye seemed to be on her, a mixture of pity, amusement, and suspicion. She was no longer a person. She was a story, a piece of town lore, the woman who had driven a man to madness. The shame was a physical cloak, heavy and suffocating. She hurried back to her room, locked the door, and sank onto her bed, her body shaking with silent, powerless rage. She would not be his charity case. She would not be the town's fool. She would sooner starve. Late that afternoon, there was a soft knock on her door. It was Sarah, the sheriff's young daughter who delivered the weekly newspaper for a few pennies. The girl held out a small, folded piece of paper. "This is for you, Mrs. Green," she said, her eyes wide with a child's unfiltered curiosity. "The new man at the store asked me to bring it." Martha took the note. Her fingers were stiff. After the girl had gone, she unfolded it. The handwriting was rough and blocky. The letters formed with the painstaking effort of a man unaccustomed to holding a pen. There were only a few words, but they were clear enough. "If you want a job, come to the store." Martha stared at the paper. It was not an offer of a gift. It was not a demand. It was an offer of work, a wage, a means to earn her way, to stand on her own 2 feet, to pay back the debt she felt he had so publicly thrust upon her. It was a lifeline, but it was a lifeline that would tie her directly to the man who was the source of her deepest humiliation. Her pride screamed at her to tear the paper to shreds. Her empty stomach and the cold reality of her situation argued otherwise. The note lay in her hand, a simple piece of paper that held the full weight of her future. For 3 days, the note lay on the small, rickety table in her room. It was a stark white rectangle in the gloom, a silent testament to her crossroads. During those 3 days, Martha drank water and ate nothing. The hunger passed from a sharp, demanding creature into a dull, pervasive ache, a weakness that settled deep in her bones and clouded her thoughts. She watched the sun rise and set through her one small window, painting the red dust outside in shades of orange and purple, and she wrestled with the twin demons of pride and survival. Pride told her to tear the note to pieces, to burn it and scatter the ashes, to maintain the one thing she had left, survival. A more practical and persistent voice whispered of the slow, grinding misery of starvation, of the ultimate futility of dying for a principle no one else would ever know or respect. On the morning of the 4th day, she knew she had lost the battle, or perhaps she had won it. She looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror above her wash basin. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes large and dark in their sockets. She saw not a proud woman, but a fading one, and in that moment, she understood that true dignity was not in starving alone in a dark room, but in the will to endure, to work, to live. She washed her face, pinned her hair with steady fingers, and put on her one clean dress. She walked out of the boarding house and into the morning sun, her steps deliberate and without a trace of the hesitation that had plagued her for days. The walk to the general store was not a walk of shame, she told herself. It was a walk of purpose. Eli was outside, using a hammer to fix a loose board on the walkway in front of the store. He worked with a quiet, focused rhythm, the blows of the hammer precise and sure. He looked up as she approached, his own face unreadable in the morning light. He stopped his work and stood, waiting. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice clear and stronger than she expected. "I received your note." He gave a single nod, his gray eyes watching her. "I will accept your offer of employment," she continued. keeping her back straight. On two conditions. First, you will pay me a fair wage, the same you would pay any man for the same work. Second, every penny I earn, after my own small living expenses are met, will go toward repaying you. For the ring, and for the provisions you left. She could not bring herself to call it a gift. Eli considered her words for a long moment. She had expected him to argue, or perhaps to dismiss her terms with a wave of his hand. Instead, he simply nodded again. "Fair," he said. It was the only word he spoke. He gestured with the hammer toward the open door of the store. "The floor needs sweeping." And so, her new life began. It was a life lived under the constant, curious gaze of the town of Copper Bend. The whispers followed her everywhere. When she weighed out sugar for Mrs. Henderson, she saw the woman's eyes flicking from her to Eli, a small, knowing smile on her lips. When she sold ammunition to a pair of prospectors, she heard one of them mutter to the other, "That is the one." The cowboys intended. The words were like small, sharp stones thrown at her back. They called her his future wife, his purchased bride, the silent cowboy's woman. The gossip cast her not as an employee earning her keep, but as an object that had been acquired, a part of the store's inventory, no different from the sacks of flour or the tins of peaches. The hurt was a constant, low burn in her chest. She had sought work to regain her independence, only to find herself more thoroughly bound to him in the town's imagination than ever before. Eli himself was a paradox. In all matters of work, he was a man of few words and direct commands. Unpack that crate, tally the inventory, the windows need washing. He never wasted a word. Yet, his actions were a silent language of their own, a language of consideration she could not decipher. One afternoon, as the relentless sun beat through the front window, creating a blinding glare where she stood behind the counter, she saw him walk outside. A few moments later, a shadow fell over the window. He had taken a length of burlap and tacked it up over the top half of the glass, creating a makeshift awning that shielded her from the worst of the light. He never mentioned it. Another time, after a long day of lifting heavy sacks of grain, she found a tin of liniment sitting on the counter by her shawl when it was time to leave. And every evening, without fail, he would leave a small parcel for her, a loaf of bread or a piece of cured meat, a silent insistence that she eat, that she not go hungry again. He expected no thanks, and she gave none. To acknowledge these small kindnesses would be to admit a relationship beyond that of employer and employee, and she was not ready for that, so they existed in a state of silent, formal truce, their days measured by the ringing of the bell above the door and the exchange of goods for coin. The dust of the store settled around them, becoming a kind of company. A shared atmosphere that was as thick and as quiet as the tension between them. Weeks turned into a month, then two. A strange, unspoken rhythm developed. The town's gossip did not cease, but it softened into a kind of accepted fact, losing its sharp, cutting edge. Martha learned the rhythms of the store, the names of the regular customers, the satisfaction of a day's hard work, and she watched Eli. She saw the way his hands, though calloused and rough, could handle a delicate piece of machinery from a music box with surprising gentleness. She noticed that while he was quiet with people, he would sometimes speak in a low murmur to the horses that were tied to the hitching post outside. One evening, as she was preparing to leave, she found him sitting at the small desk in the back room, a ledger open before him. He was not writing. He was staring at the columns of numbers, his brow furrowed in concentration, a look of profound frustration on his face. "The numbers do not add up," she asked, her voice softer than she intended. He looked up, and for the first time, she saw not a stoic cowboy, but a man who was struggling. "The numbers are fine," he said, his voice rough. "It is the letters, the words. I cannot always make them behave." And then she understood. He could read, but only barely, sounding out the words with the slow, laborious effort of a child. That night, she did not go back to her room. She pulled up a stool, lit another lamp, and spread a page from the newspaper on the desk. "The first sound is Arthur," she said, pointing to the word "the," like thunder, but softer. And so began their lessons. Every evening, after the last customer had gone and the door was locked, she would teach him. She guided his hand as he formed the letters, her fingers brushing against his, a contact that was both startling and strangely natural. She watched the hard lines of his face soften in concentration, saw the flicker of triumph in his eyes when he successfully navigated a difficult sentence. In these moments, she was not his employee, nor his charity case. She was his teacher. She had something to give him that could not be bought or sold. The balance of power, for an hour or two each night, was equal. In return, he began to teach her. One Sunday, when the store was closed, he led her to the corral behind the building where he kept his own horse, a steady, calm-eyed buckskin. "You live in this country," he said. "You should know how to ride." Her first attempts were clumsy and fearful. The horse felt like a massive, unpredictable mountain beneath her. But Eli was patient. He did not laugh at her awkwardness. His instructions were simple and clear. He showed her how to hold the reins, how to shift her weight, how to communicate with the animal not through force, but through a quiet, confident touch. He held the bridle as she circled the corral, his presence a steady anchor in her sea of uncertainty. The world looked different from the back of a horse, wider and more open. She felt a sense of freedom, a thrill of power she had not known she was missing. One evening in late summer, the sky, which had been a clear, hard blue all day, turned a bruised purple. The air grew heavy and still. Then the rain came. It was not a gentle shower, but a violent, torrential downpour that turned the dusty street into a river of red mud. The wind howled, rattling the windows of the store. They had been in the middle of a reading lesson when the storm broke. The storeroom at the back was the driest place, and they took refuge there, sitting on crates amidst the smells of burlap and dried apples. The drumming of the rain on the tin roof was deafening, isolating them from the rest of the world. A draft slipped through a crack in the wall, and Martha shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Eli noticed. He stood up and took off his heavy denim jacket. It was worn and faded, but clean. He draped it over her shoulders without a word. The jacket was heavy, and it smelled of leather, dust, and him. The warmth of his body still clung to the fabric. "It is just weather, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the roar of the storm. "But you are shivering." She looked up at him, at his face illuminated by the flickering light of the single lantern, and for the first time, she saw past the quiet cowboy, past the mysterious benefactor. In the depths of his gray eyes, she saw something else, something old and weary. It was a deep, abiding sadness, a shadow that had nothing to do with the storm outside. It was the haunted look of a man who had seen things no man should have to see. In that moment, she knew the rumors were true. He had been a soldier. The war was not over for him. It lived behind his eyes. That night, the storm passed, but a different kind of turmoil remained. Eli unrolled his bedroll on the floor of the storeroom, insisting she take the small cot he had set up in the back. The sounds of the sleeping town and the dripping eaves were all that broke the silence. Sometime, in the deep hours before dawn, she was woken by a sound. It was a low, guttural cry from the storeroom, followed by a muffled thrashing. She slipped off the cot, her heart pounding, peeking around the doorframe. She saw him in the moonlight that streamed through the back window. He was caught in the grip of a nightmare, his body tense, his hands clenched into fists. He muttered something, a single, broken word: water. Without thinking, she moved to his side. She knelt on the floor and gently, hesitantly, placed her hand on his shoulder. His skin was hot and damp. He flinched at her touch, his whole body going rigid. But he did not pull away. He did not open his eyes. But the frantic, desperate energy seemed to drain out of him. The tension in his shoulders eased. His breathing deepened and slowed. She stayed there for a long time, her hand resting on his shoulder. A silent, comforting presence in the darkness. He did not stir again. The next morning, neither of them spoke of it. But something had changed. A barrier had been crossed. The change, however, also made the town's perception of them harder to bear. One afternoon, a woman named Mrs. Gable, whose tongue was known to be the sharpest in town, came into the store. She made her purchases, her eyes darting between Martha and Eli with undisguised malice. As Martha handed her the change, Mrs. Gable leaned in close. "You have done very well for yourself." "Mrs. Green," she said, her voice a poisonous whisper. "It is not every woman who can lure a man into buying her a whole establishment. You must be very persuasive." The insult was so direct, so cruel, that it stole the breath from Martha's lungs. She could feel the blood drain from her face. She looked toward Eli, who was standing a few feet away, stacking firewood. He had heard, she knew he had, his back was to them, but she saw his shoulders tense, his hands stop their work. She waited for him to turn, to say something, to defend her honor, to defend his own. He did nothing. He remained silent, his back to her, as if he had not heard a thing. After a moment, he resumed stacking the wood. "Mrs." Gable gave a triumphant, ugly little smile and swept out of the store. The silence that followed was heavier and more suffocating than any she had ever known. All the frustration, all the humiliation, all the anger she had swallowed for months rose up in a bitter tide. That evening, after the store was closed, she confronted him. "You heard what she said," she said, her voice shaking with suppressed fury. He turned from the counter he was wiping down, his face a familiar, unreadable mask. "They are just words." "Just words," she cried, her control finally snapping. "They are lies. Eli, they call me your property. They say I seduced you into buying this store. And you say nothing. You stand there and let them say it. You let them strip me of my name, of my dignity. Why do you think your silence is a shield? Do you think it is protecting me?" He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not indifference, but a deep, helpless sorrow. "There is nothing to say that they will listen to," he said quietly. "Then you are a coward," she shot back, the word tasting like acid on her tongue. "You hide behind your silence and you let me take the blows. I would rather you had let me starve than put me in this cage." She could see that her words had hit him, had struck some deep, vulnerable place. A flicker of pain crossed his face before the mask of stoicism fell back into place. He turned away from her, and the conversation was over. That night, she knew she could not stay. His silence was not a shield. It was a wall she could no longer live behind. In the dead of night, while he slept his troubled sleep in the storeroom, she packed her few meager belongings into a small satchel. She took the wages she had earned and saved, a small but respectable sum, on the counter, where he would be sure to see it in the morning. She left a note. It was short, written in the neat, clear hand she had tried to teach him. "I am not a person to be pitied." Then, with one last look around the quiet, sleeping store that had been both her prison and her sanctuary, she slipped out the back door and disappeared into the darkness. The darkness outside the store was a welcome cloak. Martha did not run. She walked with a steady, determined pace that ate up the ground, carrying her away from the center of town and the man she was leaving behind. Her satchel was light, but her heart was a leaden weight in her chest. She did not know where she was going, only that she could not stay. To remain would be to accept the role the town had cast for her, a role Eli's silence had tacitly endorsed. She found a small, clean room for rent above the laundress's shop at the far edge of Copper Bend, a place where few people went and no one would think to look for her. She paid for 2 nights, just enough time to wait for the eastbound stagecoach, For 2 days, she existed in a state of suspended animation. She bought food from the laundress, a kind woman who asked no questions, and she watched the dust devils dance on the flats beyond the town. She told herself she had done the right thing. She had chosen her own dignity over a borrowed, compromised existence. Yet, a hollow ache persisted, a feeling that she had not solved a problem, but had merely run from it. The memory of Eli's pained eyes when she had called him a coward was a ghost that would not leave her be. On the third day, the past rode back into town. He came on a big black stallion, a man who seemed to suck the very light from the air around him. Silas Crane was in his late 40s, with a prosperous belly straining the buttons of his vest and a face flushed with whiskey and arrogance. He had owned the horse ranch where Eli had once worked, before a bad run of cards and a worse run of luck had forced him to sell it and leave the territory. Now, it seemed, his luck had turned. He was flanked by 2 hired men whose faces were as hard and empty as the desert landscape. They made straight for the saloon, their laughter loud and grating. Silas Crane took a seat at a table where he could watch the entire street. It was from this vantage point that he saw Martha as she made a brief trip to the well for a bucket of water. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He remembered her, the quiet, proud widow from the church socials, the one who had turned him down flat when he had offered to buy her a drink some months back. An insult his ego had not forgotten. "Well, well," he said to one of his men, "look what the cat dragged in. Still as prim and proper as a preacher's wife, and twice as poor, I imagine." He took a long drink of whiskey. "I wonder what she is doing for coin these days." His eyes narrowed with a mean sort of curiosity when he learned from the bartender that the quiet cowboy, his former hand Eli Turner, had bought the general store. The bartender, a man who loved gossip more than he loved whiskey, was happy to supply the rest of the story. A lurid and embellished tale of how the cowboy had bought the place on a whim, all for the sake of that very same widow. Silas Crane's smile turned venomous. The world, it seemed, had a wonderful sense of symmetry. 2 people who had slighted him, delivered into his hands in one neat package. He tossed a coin on the bar. "Let's go pay our respects to the new shopkeeper," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Eli was sweeping the floor of the empty store when the bell above the door jangled. The place had felt hollow for 2 days, the silence a constant, ringing accusation. Her note still sat on the counter, the 4 words a judgment he could not refute. He looked up and felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Silas Crane stood there, flanked by his men, blocking the light from the door. "Turner!" Silas boomed, striding into the store as if he owned it. "I hear you have come into some money. Traded your saddle for an apron. I cannot decide if that is a step up or a step down." Eli leaned the broom against the wall. He did not speak. His face was a calm, expressionless mask, but his hands, at his sides, were curled into tight fists. Silas strolled around the store, picking things up and putting them down. His eyes filled with contempt. A general store, a fine, respectable business. And I hear it came with a bonus. He stopped and turned, his eyes glinting. "The little widow, Martha Green. I always did have an eye for her. A bit skinny for my taste, but proud. I like that in a woman. Makes them more satisfying to break." "That is enough, Silas," Eli said, his voice low and dangerous. "Is it?" Silas laughed. "A harsh, ugly sound." "I do not think so. I hear you paid a pretty price for her. Bought her ring, then bought the whole store just to keep her close. Tell me, Turner, was she worth the investment?" He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial sneer. "You know, I am feeling flush these days. Maybe I will make you an offer. I could always use a woman to keep my house in order. I will buy her back from you. Name your price. I am sure we can come to an arrangement." The air in the store crackled with tension. Eli's control, the iron discipline he had cultivated for years, was stretched to its breaking point. He could see the fight Silas was trying to pick, the public humiliation he was trying to engineer, and he would not give it to him. "She is not for sale," Eli said, his voice flat and cold as stone. "Now get out of my store!" "Your store?" Silas mocked. For now, he smiled, a promise of future trouble in his eyes. "We will talk again. Turner." He turned and sauntered out, his men following like shadows. The encounter left Eli trembling with a rage he had not allowed himself to feel in years. It was not the insults to himself that mattered. It was the way Silas had spoken of Martha, as if she were a horse to be traded, a piece of property to be bought and sold. It was the very thing she had accused him of allowing, the very perception he had been powerless to fight with his clumsy, inadequate words. That same afternoon, Martha was packing her satchel, preparing for the morning stage, when there was a knock on her door. It was Dr. Hemlock, the town's physician, a kind, elderly man with gentle eyes and hands that smelled of carbolic soap. "Mrs. Green," he said, his voice filled with concern. "The laundress told me you were leaving us. I came to see if you were unwell." "I am fine, doctor. Thank you," she said, not meeting his eyes. "It is just time for me to move on." The doctor looked at her pale face, at the dark circles under her eyes, and he saw more than just a woman preparing for a journey. He had been the one to tend to her husband in his final days. He had seen her quiet strength, her unbending pride, and he had known Eli Turner for years, had treated him for a fever once and had seen the scars, both physical and otherwise, that the man carried. "Martha," he said, his voice soft, "Copper Bend is a hard place, and its people can be harder. They talk because their own lives are small. Do not let their idle gossip drive you away from a good man." Martha's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with a spark of their old fire. "A good man, doctor. He stood by and let them call me his possession. He bought me, in their eyes, and he never said a word to deny it." Dr. Hemlock sighed, a long, weary sound. He looked out the window for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. "Martha," he said, turning back to her, "there are things you do not know, things that make it hard for a man to speak. Can I tell you a story? It is not my story to tell, but I think, perhaps, it needs to be told." She hesitated, then nodded. The old doctor sat down on the one straight-backed chair in the room. Eli was just a boy when the war started. He began, a farm boy from Pennsylvania. He signed up with the Union Army, full of fire and patriotism. He fought at Gettysburg. He saw things that would turn a man's soul to stone, but the worst was yet to come. He was captured in '64 and sent to a prison camp in Georgia, Andersonville. The name hung in the air, a byword for human suffering. He was not alone. The doctor continued, his voice low. His young wife, Sarah, had followed the army, working as a camp laundress, trying to stay close to him. When he was captured, she refused to leave. She stayed nearby, in a makeshift camp for families, trying to smuggle food and medicine into the prison. She was caught. Martha felt a chill crawl up her spine. They did not put her in the prison with the men. They had another place, a collection of miserable huts just outside the stockade, a place with no food, no medicine, nothing. They put the women and children there and just let them be. As an example, Eli could see the camp from inside the stockade. He could see her every day. He watched his wife, the girl he had loved since they were children, starving to death less than 100 yards away. He was starving, too, but that was nothing compared to the agony of watching her fade. He saw her begging for a crust of bread. He saw men, guards, laugh at her. He was helpless. He could do nothing but watch her die. The doctor paused, his own eyes misty with the horror of the story. He survived the camp, but the boy who went in never came out. The man who was left made a vow to himself. He swore on his wife's memory that he would never again stand by and watch a person go hungry. that he would never again be helpless while someone suffered in front of him. The pieces of the puzzle that was Eli Turner slammed into place in Martha's mind with the force of a physical blow. The way he had looked at her that first day, her hand empty, her face etched with hunger, his wild, inexplicable act of buying the store, the silent, persistent offerings of food, the way he looked away when she tried to thank him, the nightmare, the sorrow in his eyes. It was not charity, it was not pity. It was a desperate, frantic attempt to keep a promise made to a ghost. It was his own salvation he had been seeking, not hers. Keep the gold and stay, the words echoed in her memory. No longer a riddle, but a prayer. A prayer that she would not suffer the same fate as the wife he had lost. "Oh, God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "What have I done?" She did not wait for the doctor to say another word. She grabbed her shawl and ran from the room, down the stairs, and into the street. She ran as she had never run before, her heart pounding with a terrible, urgent need to get back to him, to take back her cruel words, to tell him that she finally understood. As she neared the store, she heard it, the sound of shouting, the crash of breaking glass. Her blood ran cold. She burst through the door, and the scene that met her eyes was one of chaos. Silas Crane and his 2 men were tearing the place apart. Sacks of flour had been slashed open, their contents dusting the floor like a fine white snow. Tins and jars had been swept from the shelves, and in the middle of it all was Eli. He was not fighting back, not in earnest. He was defending, trying to absorb the blows, to push the men away without escalating the violence. But he was outnumbered. One of Silas's men held his arms, while Silas himself, his face purple with rage, drove a fist into Eli's stomach. Something inside Martha snapped. All the fear, all the pride, all the confusion that had ruled her for months was burned away in a single, incandescent flash of protective fury. She did not scream. She did not hesitate. Her eyes scanned the store and fell upon the double-barreled shotgun that Eli kept loaded with rock salt. Propped behind the counter, she moved with a speed and purpose that surprised even herself. She darted behind the counter, her hands closing around the cool, smooth wood of the shotgun stock. She was a small woman, and the gun was heavy, but in that moment, it felt as light as a feather. She rose from behind the counter, brought the gun to her shoulder, and pulled both triggers. The roar of the shotgun blast was deafening in the enclosed space. The rock salt shattered the lantern hanging from the ceiling, showering the floor with harmless crystals and broken glass. The violence stopped instantly. Silas Crane and his men froze, their heads whipping around to stare at her. She stood there, a small, fierce figure in the flour-dusted air. The smoking barrels of the shotgun held steady in her hands. Eli, released from the hold, stumbled back against a shelf, breathing heavily, his eyes wide with disbelief. The sound of the blast had brought people running. The doorway and the front window filled with the faces of the townspeople, their expressions a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. Silas Crane was the first to find his voice. He let out a harsh laugh. "Well, look at that," he sneered, though his eyes were wary of the gun. "The little mouse has claws. Are you going to shoot me, girl, all to protect the man who bought and paid for you?" Martha took a step forward, the shotgun never wavering. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried with its own authority, clear and ringing in the sudden silence. "I am his employee," she declared, her eyes sweeping over the faces in the doorway, meeting every gaze without flinching. "I work for a wage, and I earn my keep. This man is my employer. He is not my owner." Her gaze settled on Silas, cold and hard as steel. "You are wrong about him. He did not buy me." She paused, her voice softening but losing none of its intensity as she looked at Eli, a look of profound, dawning understanding on her face. "He saved me." The town watched, silent and stunned, the narrative they had so carefully constructed. The one of the foolish cowboy and his purchased woman was being dismantled before their very eyes. They were not seeing a victim. They were seeing a fighter, a woman standing her ground, defending her honor and the honor of the man who stood behind her, with nothing more than a shotgun and the undeniable power of the truth. For a moment, the world held its breath. The silence in the store was absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of Eli's breathing and the distant, startled cry of a horse. The faces in the doorway were a frozen gallery of disbelief. Martha's words, her fierce and sudden defense, had shattered the town's simple narrative, leaving a void that was quickly filled with a tense, dangerous uncertainty. Silas Crane's face, already flushed with whiskey, darkened to a shade of mottled purple. He had been publicly defied, his power and menace dismissed by a slip of a woman with a shotgun. The laughter died in his throat, choked off by a surge of pure, violent rage. Humiliation was a poison in his veins, and it demanded an outlet. "You foolish woman!" he snarled, his voice a low, guttural rasp. He took a menacing step forward, his hand dropping to the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. "You think that toy protects him? You think it protects you." His lunge was sudden and brutish. He was not aiming for the gun. He was aiming for her, to seize her, to prove his point, to make her his property through sheer force in front of the whole town. Eli moved like a thunderclap. The weariness, the defensiveness, vanished, replaced by the swift, lethal economy of a man who had lived through the crucible of war. He threw himself between Martha and Silas, his body absorbing the impact of Crane's charge. The two men crashed against the main counter, sending a glass jar of hard candy shattering to the floor. It was the signal for chaos to erupt. Silas's two hired men, seeing their employer engaged, drew their pistols. One of them, a man with nervous, shifty eyes, raised his weapon and fired. A wild, panicked shot aimed at nothing in particular. The report of the gun was a sharp, cracking whip of sound that tore through the tense silence. It was followed an instant later by a scream from the crowd outside. A woman's voice, high and piercing with terror. A young boy, no more than 10 years old, who had been peering through the window, crumpled to the ground, a dark stain blossoming on the shoulder of his simple cotton shirt. The sight of the fallen child changed everything. The town's morbid curiosity turned to collective horror and outrage. This was no longer a saloon brawl that had spilled into the street. It was an assault on them, on their children, on the fragile peace of their community. Eli saw the boy fall. He saw the shift in the crowd. He saw the second hired man bringing his pistol to bear on Martha, who still stood, stunned, the empty shotgun in her hands. There was no more time for defense, no more time for absorbing blows. He shoved Silas away with a surge of desperate strength. As he did, the pistol in his own holster, a weapon he carried but had not drawn in years, seemed to find its way into his hand. He did not aim. He did not think. He reacted, his soldier's instincts taking over. He fired once. The bullet struck the hired man's gun hand, sending the pistol spinning from his grasp with a cry of pain. But the first man, the one with the nervous eyes who had shot the boy, turned his attention to Eli. He fired again. This time, the bullet found its mark. Martha saw it happen as if time itself had slowed to a crawl. She saw the flash from the gun, saw Eli's body jolt, a sudden, violent spasm. A red flower bloomed on his left shoulder, blossoming through the fabric of his blue shirt. A look of shocked surprise crossed his face, followed by a grimace of pure, searing pain. He did not fall. He staggered, his left arm going limp at his side, but he remained on his feet. His own gun, still in his right hand, came up. He fired again. A single, deliberate shot. The nervous man cried out and clutched his leg, collapsing into the flour on the floor. The store was a maelstrom of violence and noise. Outside, horses whinnied and reared, their reins pulled by panicked hands. The air was thick with gunpowder, dust, and the fine, sweet-smelling powder of the spilled flour. A bizarre combination that clogged the throat. The townspeople were shouting, some running for cover, others surging forward in a wave of anger. Silas Crane, momentarily forgotten, saw his advantage evaporating. He scrambled for his own pistol, his face a mask of desperation, but he was too late. Through the haze of smoke and dust, Martha moved. She dropped the useless shotgun and grabbed Eli's good arm, her small frame straining with the effort. "Come on," she gasped, her voice raw. "Behind the counter, now." He stumbled with her, his boots slipping in the scattered candy and spilled molasses. His face was pale, a sheen of sweat on his brow, but his eyes were fixed on her, a look of fierce, protective concern still burning in their gray depths. They collapsed together behind the solid oak of the counter, the sounds of the brawl and the angry shouts of the town muffled slightly. For a moment, they were in their own world, an island of pain and fear in a sea of chaos. Eli leaned heavily against the shelves, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The blood from his shoulder was soaking his shirt, dripping in a slow, steady rhythm onto the floorboards. Martha's hands were shaking, but her mind was clear. The sight of his blood, of his pain, had burned away every last vestige of her own fear. She looked at the wound, at the torn fabric in the dark, welling blood. She had to stop the bleeding. Without a second thought, she gathered the hem of her simple cotton dress in her fists. With a strength born of pure desperation, she tore a long, wide strip from the bottom of her skirt. The sound of the ripping fabric was loud in the small space. "Hold still," she commanded, her voice trembling but firm. She bunched the cloth into a thick pad and pressed it hard against his shoulder. He hissed in pain, his whole body tensing, but he did not pull away. He watched her, his eyes clouded with pain but intensely focused on her face. He lifted his right hand, the one that was not covered in his own blood, and laid it over her, pressing her hand more firmly against the wound. His touch was weak, but his grip was insistent. "Martha!" he rasped, his voice strained. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound that terrified her. "If I fall, do not sell that ring again." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. In the midst of the chaos, with his life bleeding out onto the floor, his thoughts were of her survival, of that small circle of gold that had started it all. He was not just thinking of her future. He was trying to protect her from his own past, from the fate that had befallen the woman he had been unable to save. Tears, hot and sudden, welled in her eyes, blurring his pale face. They were not tears of fear, but of a profound, heartbreaking, and fiercely beautiful understanding. This was his confession. This was his heart, laid bare and bleeding in front of her. She leaned closer, her face just inches from his. Her voice, when she spoke, was a ragged, tear-choked whisper, but it held all the strength and certainty in the world. "I would sell my life first." A faint, ghostly smile touched the corner of his lips. His eyes fluttered, the strength it took to keep them open seeming to ebb away with his blood. The sound of a heavy, authoritative voice cut through the noise from outside. "This is Sheriff Miller. Throw down your weapons and come out with your hands in the air." The scuffling and shouting in the store died down. There was a moment of tense silence, then the sound of pistols clattering to the floor. The immediate danger was over. But behind the counter, a new and more terrible danger was present. Eli's head slumped forward, his body going slack. The hand that had been pressing on hers slipped away, falling limply to his side. As it fell, his fingers uncurled, lying in the center of his palm, gleaming in the dim light, was her mother's gold ring. He must have been holding it in his fist the entire time. "Eli," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "Eli." He did not respond. He slid down the wall of shelves, leaving a smear of red, and collapsed onto the floor in a heap. His eyes were closed. His face was a waxy, bloodless white. He lay utterly still, his open palm resting on the floor, the gold ring a single, perfect point of light in the deepening shadows. For a heartbeat, Martha froze, the world narrowing to the sight of his still form. The chaos outside, the arrival of the sheriff, the fate of Silas Crane, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the man at her feet, the man whose silent heart she had so terribly misjudged. Then, a scream tore itself from her throat, a raw, primal sound of terror and loss that cut through the sudden quiet of the store. "Doctor, somebody get the doctor, please! Help him!" She fell to her knees beside him, gathering his head into her lap, her tears falling freely now onto his pale, still face. She pressed her hands to the wound, trying to will the life back into him, her own heart breaking with every precious drop of blood that soaked into the rough wood of the floor. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. The harsh white glare of the afternoon was softening, and the sky was shifting from a metallic blue to a deep, dramatic orange. The long rays of the evening sun slanted through the dusty front window, cutting through the haze of smoke and flour. They illuminated the scene of devastation, the wreckage and the blood, but they painted it all in a warm, ethereal glow. The wild land was soaked in blood, as it so often was, but the sky above, vast and indifferent, was alight with the unmistakable color of hope. The world outside the counter dissolved into a blur of motion and noise. Dr. Hemlock seemed to materialize out of the chaos, his bag in hand, his face a grim mask of professional calm. He knelt beside Eli, his fingers immediately going to the pulse in his neck, his eyes assessing the bloody wound with a practiced efficiency that seemed to push back the encroaching panic. "Get him into the back room," he commanded, his voice a sharp, clear instrument that cut through Martha's terror. "Now, I need light, boiled water, and every clean strip of cloth you can find." The next hours were a waking nightmare, a desperate, focused struggle against the encroaching shadows of death. The sheriff and a few of the town's men carried Eli's limp form into the small room behind the store and laid him on the narrow cot. Martha moved in a fugue state, her hands and mind obeying the doctor's commands without question. She lit every lamp and lantern she could find, turning the small room into a stark, brightly lit stage. She stoked the fire in the small pot-bellied stove and set a kettle of water to boil. She tore her remaining petticoats into neat, clean strips, her hands moving with a mechanical steadiness that belied the frantic prayer screaming in her heart. She watched as Dr. Hemlock, his sleeves rolled up, probed the wound with his gleaming instruments. She saw the lead bullet, dark and misshapen, when he finally extracted it and dropped it with a clinical clink into a metal basin. She held the lamp steady as he stitched the torn flesh back together, her own stomach churning at the sight, but her hand never wavered. Through it all, Eli remained terrifyingly still, his breathing a shallow, almost imperceptible whisper. Outside, the town dealt with its own aftermath. Sheriff Miller, his face like thunder, had arrested Silas Crane and his 2 men without incident, Silas, his drunken rage having evaporated into a sullen, fearful silence, offered no resistance. The injured boy had been carried to the doctor's office, his wound painful but not mortal, a fact that spread through the crowd as a small, collective sigh of relief. When the doctor had done all he could, he straightened up, his back cracking with the strain. He looked at Martha, at her pale, determined face, at the bloodstains on her dress and hands. "He is strong," the doctor said, his voice gentle but laced with exhaustion. "He has lost a great deal of blood. The next 24 hours will tell the tale. Keep him warm. Try to get some water into him if he stirs. And pray." Martha simply nodded, her throat too tight for words. After the doctor left, she was alone with Eli in the quiet, lamp-lit room. The store outside was a wreck, a monument to the violence that had almost claimed him, but she did not think of that. She pulled a stool to the side of the cot, took Eli's cold, limp hand in both of her own, and began her vigil. She did not leave his side for 2 days and 2 nights. She dozed fitfully in the chair, her head nodding forward until the cold woke her with a start. She bathed his face with cool water, moistened his cracked lips with a damp cloth, and whispered to him quiet words of encouragement, of apology, of things she did not yet have the courage to name. The town and the world ceased to exist outside the four walls of that small room. But the town had not forgotten her. On the morning of the second day, she heard the jingle of the bell on the front door, a sound that made her flinch. She had not even thought to lock it. She walked out of the back room and into the devastated store. Standing in the middle of the flour-dusted chaos was Mrs. Miller, the sheriff's wife, a woman who had always been polite to Martha, but distant. She held a covered pot in her hands, the smell of chicken and herbs filling the air. "I thought you might need this, Mrs." Miller said, her eyes taking in the wreckage of the store and the exhaustion etched on Martha's face. She did not ask about Eli. She did not offer platitudes. She simply held out the pot. "He is a good man. What you did, it was brave." Martha took the pot, her hands trembling slightly. It was a simple offering, a pot of soup, but it felt like a peace treaty. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. "Thank you, Mary," she said, using the woman's first name without thinking. "You call if you need anything, Mrs." Miller said with a firm nod. "Anything at all." She was the first, but she was not the last. The story of what had happened had swept through Copper Bend, but this time, the story was different. It was not a tale of a foolish cowboy and his purchased woman. It was the story of the quiet widow who had stood her ground, who had faced down 3 armed men to protect her employer, who had not fled in the face of violence but had stayed to fight, and now she was staying to heal. Later that day, 2 of the miners came by, their faces grim. They did not say much. They just picked up brooms and started sweeping up the flour and the broken glass. The blacksmith's wife arrived with a basket of clean linens. The narrative had shifted, the town's judgment replaced by a quiet, grudging respect. They had watched her arrive, a hungry and desperate woman. Now, they were watching her stay. On the evening of the 3rd day, Eli's eyelids fluttered. Martha was by his side in an instant, her heart leaping into her throat. His eyes opened, just a slit at first, and they were cloudy with fever and confusion. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. She held a cup of water to his lips, and he managed to swallow a few small sips. His eyes cleared a little, and he seemed to see her, to truly recognize her for the first time. His lips moved again, forming a single, difficult word. Thank," he whispered, his voice a hoarse, scratchy thing, the sound of a voice that had not been truly used in a very long time. It was a simple word, but hearing him say it to her, was like feeling the first warmth of the sun after a long, brutal winter. It was the first brick in a bridge that was being built across the chasm of their shared silence. "Rest, Eli," she whispered back, her hand gently brushing the hair from his forehead. "Just rest." His recovery was slow, but it was steady. As the days turned into a week, then, too, the fever receded, and a little of his strength returned. During that time, Martha became the master of 2 worlds. In the small back room, she was his nurse, changing his bandages, coaxing him to eat the broth and soup the townswomen brought, and reading to him from the newspaper in a low, steady voice. In the main part of the store, she was the proprietor. With the help of the town, she had cleaned up the mess. She had restocked the shelves, tallied the losses, and reopened for business. The sign above the door, which had read McCall General Store, was taken down by the blacksmith. A few days later, he returned with a new one, freshly painted in bold, black letters, Turner's Store. When Eli was finally strong enough to sit up in a chair, propped up with pillows, she began to bring the ledger books to him. His left arm was still in a sling, but he could work with his right. Together, they went over the accounts, their heads bent close together over the columns of numbers. She would read the names and the items, and he would make the entries, his handwriting still clumsy. but improving with every passing day. They were partners. It was an unspoken, unacknowledged fact, but it was as solid and real as the oak counter that separated them from the world. As his strength grew, so did his voice. He began to speak more, not in long speeches, but in short, direct sentences. He would ask about the day's business, about which ranchers had paid their accounts, about the price of cornmeal, and sometimes he would ask about her. He would notice the smudge of flour on her cheek and tell her so with a small, quiet smile. He would see her rub her tired shoulders at the end of a long day and ask if she was all right. Each word was a small revelation, a glimpse into the man who had hidden behind a wall of silence for so long. One afternoon, a pair of young boys, orphans who lived at the church and did odd jobs around town for their keep, were trying to unload a heavy crate from a wagon. They were struggling, the crate too awkward and heavy for them. Eli, who was sitting on the walkway in front of the store, getting some sun for the first time, called them over. "You are going to hurt your backs that way," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Let me show you how to use a lever." He directed them to a long piece of timber, and with a few calm instructions, he showed them how to position it, how to use their weight and the simple power of physics to move the crate with ease. It became a regular thing. The boys started hanging around the store, and Eli, in his quiet way, began to teach them. He taught them how to mend a harness, how to properly stack firewood so it would dry, how to tell a good horse from a lame one. He never raised his voice. He was patient and clear, and the boys, who had known little in the way of steady, gentle male guidance, soaked it up like the dry earth soaks up rain. Watching him with the boys, Martha had an idea of her own. There was a small, unused corner of the store, a space by the window that got good light in the afternoons. She cleared it out, brought in a small table and 2 chairs from the back room, and placed a few of her own books on the table, a well-worn copy of Shakespeare, a book of poems, and a primer. She called it the reading corner. She told the children who came into the store with their parents that they were welcome to sit there, to look at the books, as long as their hands were clean. At first they were shy, but soon the corner was never empty. She would see small heads bent in concentration, hear the whispered sounding out of words. Sometimes she would sit with them for a few minutes, helping them with a difficult passage, her old identity as a teacher merging with her new one as a shopkeeper. The store, which had once been just a place of commerce, was becoming something more. It was becoming a center, a heart for the community. And in the middle of it all were Martha and Eli. The quiet rhythm of their days was punctuated by small, shared moments. A glance across the counter that held a world of unspoken understanding. A smile that passed between them when one of the children finally mastered a new word. The easy, comfortable silence that now existed. A silence born not of tension, but of companionship. One evening, as she was closing up, tallying the day's earnings in the ledger, she made a mistake, her tired mind transposing 2 numbers, and she let out a small sigh of frustration. "Hard day at the office." "Ma'am," a quiet voice said from behind her. She turned. Eli was leaning against the doorframe, a faint, teasing light in his gray eyes. "Just a long one," she said, a smile touching her own lips. "And I do wish you would stop calling me ma'am. My name is Martha." "I know what your name is," he said, his smile widening just a little. "I'd just like to be formal with the boss." He pushed himself off the doorframe and walked over to the counter. He looked around the clean, orderly store, at the well-stocked shelves, at the small reading corner where a book still lay open. "You have a knack for this," he said, his voice sincere, "but you are a terror when the flour shipment is late." He looked at her, and his eyes were full of a warm, gentle humor she had never seen there before. "I do believe this store has the feistiest proprietress in all of Arizona." She felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a warmth that had nothing to do with the heat of the day. She closed the ledger and looked at him. her own eyes sparkling with a wit she had thought long buried. "Well," she said, her voice light and teasing, "that only happens when the proprietor stays silent for too long." He chuckled, a low, rusty sound that was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. It was the sound of a man coming back to life, the sound of a new beginning, rising from the ashes of a violent, painful past. In the warm, lamplit air of the quiet store, surrounded by the scent of coffee and leather and the promise of a shared tomorrow, they stood together, two survivors who were finally, after a long and difficult journey, finding their way home. The land did not change. Outside the walls of Turner's store, the Arizona Territory of 1892 remained a place of stark and brutal truths. The desert, a vast, rust-colored canvas stretching to the horizon, was a constant reminder of the thin line between survival and ruin. It was a landscape that offered no charity, a place where life was earned through sweat, grit, and an unending vigilance against the elements. The wind still carried the fine red dust that coated everything, a persistent grit that worked its way into the seams of clothing and the lines of a person's face. It was a hard country, and it made for hard people, or, at least, it revealed the true substance of a person, stripping away all that was unnecessary until only the core remained. But inside the store, the world had been remade. In the quiet hours after the last customer had gone and the door had been locked for the night, the space took on the quality of a sanctuary. The air, which had once been thick with the sour smell of Mr. McCall's cheap cigars and the sharp scent of pickle brine, now held a different character. It was a complex and comforting perfume, the honest, earthy smell of sacked potatoes and onions, the sweet promise of coffee beans and molasses, the clean, crisp scent of new calico and freshly sawn wood. It was the smell of sustenance, of industry, of life itself. This store, this simple wooden building in the middle of a parched and unforgiving land, had become the undeniable heart of Copper Bend. It was more than just a place to buy nails and flour. It was the town's crossroads, its forum, its confessional. It was where news was exchanged over the counter, where credit was extended on the strength of a handshake, where a child's penny could be solemnly traded for a single piece of hard candy. It was a place built on the fragile but essential currency of human trust. Martha felt this transformation in her bones. The store was no longer just a building. It had a pulse, a rhythm, a soul that was intrinsically tied to the lives of the people who passed through its doors each day. It was a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of settings, survival was not a solitary endeavor. It was an act of community, woven together by threads of labor and quiet kindness. As Martha moved through the store in the warm glow of the lanterns, her nightly ritual of setting things to rights had become a form of meditation. Each object she touched seemed to resonate with a deeper meaning. The heavy, smooth weight of the scoop in the flour barrel was a world away from the gnawing emptiness that had once defined her days. Bread, she now understood, was never just bread. It was the physical manifestation of compassion. It was the answer to the most fundamental human question, the silent plea of a hungry soul. Eli's first offering to her, that parcel of food left on the counter, had been a clumsy, unspoken sermon on the subject. He had not offered pity. He had offered sustenance, the one thing he had been powerless to give the woman he had lost so long ago. The store itself had become a symbol of their shared rebirth. For her, it was the home she had lost, a place of purpose and security that had risen from the ashes of her own despair. For Eli, she was beginning to see it was a fortress. It was a place where he could stand guard against the hunger and helplessness that haunted his memories, by feeding the community, by offering a fair price and an honest measure. He was fighting the ghosts of Andersonville every single day. The store was his atonement, his living promise to a past he could never change. And then there was the ring. She kept it in a small, velvet-lined box tucked away in a locked drawer beneath the counter. She took it out sometimes in the quiet of the evening, its gold warm and heavy in her palm. It was no longer just a link to her mother, a memory of a life left behind. It had been baptized in the red dust of the street, purchased at the price of a man's pride, held in his hand as his life bled out onto the floorboards. It was a symbol of her own dignity, lost and then fiercely reclaimed. It was the memory of a desperate promise whispered in a moment of terror. It was the promise of a future she was only now beginning to allow herself to imagine. It was a perfect, unbroken circle, a testament to the fact that some things, the things that truly mattered, could not be bought or sold. The journey to this quiet, hopeful place had been a passage through fire. She could clearly map the seasons of her own heart by the quality of the light that had defined her days. It had begun under the white, merciless glare of the sun, a light that bleached the world of all color and offered no shade, no respite. That had been the time of her deepest despair, a time of utter exposure and vulnerability. Then came the dust, the constant, obscuring haze that mirrored the confusion and humiliation of her new life in the store, a time when she could not see the path forward, when her own identity felt lost in the swirl of town gossip. The shadows had come next, the deep, frightening darkness of the storeroom, of Eli's nightmares, of the violent confrontation with Silas Crane. It was a time of fear, a time when the world seemed to be closing in. But now, they lived in the light of the fire, in the warm, steady glow of the lanterns that filled the store each evening. It was a gentle, forgiving light. It did not erase the scars or the hard memories, but it softened their edges. It was a light that cast long, comforting shadows, creating pockets of peace and intimacy in the quiet corners of the store. It was the light of a hearth, of a home. It was the light of hope, a small, man-made flame held against the vast, encroaching darkness of the desert night. The rhythm of their story had shifted, too. The beginning had been a slow, agonizing crawl, each day a new lesson in the calculus of hunger and pride. The middle, the violent climax in the store, had been a terrifying, breathless rush, a whirlwind of fear and action where seconds stretched into eternities. But now, they had settled into a new pace, a rhythm that was as warm, deep, and steady as a heartbeat in the quiet of the night. Their days were filled with the simple, repetitive tasks of running a business, but their evenings were rich with a growing, unspoken tenderness. The language between them had evolved from a stilted, formal exchange into a comfortable, easy shorthand. Their conversations were still composed of the plain, sturdy words of everyday life, the practical dialogue of people who lived close to the bone. There were no grand pronouncements, no flowery declarations. This was the West, and feelings were more often demonstrated than spoken. A look from Eli as she helped a child sound out a word in the reading corner held more eloquence than 1,000 pretty speeches. The way she instinctively knew when he needed a cup of coffee, placing it by his elbow without a word as he worked on the ledgers, was a poem in its own right. Theirs was a love story written in the language of shared labor and quiet, steady regard. It had the feel of authentic, hard-won affection, as natural and unadorned as the landscape that surrounded them. The entire arc of their journey felt like a circle, a story that had begun and ended in the same place, yet had transformed everything in its path. It had started with a desperate transaction, an attempt to trade a piece of her past for a piece of bread. The store had been a place of commerce, a place where worth was measured in dollars and cents. Now, it was a place of sharing. The reading corner, Eli's patient lessons with the orphan boys, the quiet extension of credit to a family down on their luck. These were not transactions. They were investments in the well-being of the community, acts of sharing that enriched the giver as much as the receiver. They had started with buying and selling, and they had ended with a simple, profound act of giving. Martha placed the velvet box with the ring back in its drawer and turned the key. She looked over at Eli, who was sitting by the cold stove, patiently mending a broken strap on a saddle harness. His shoulder was still stiff, but his hands were as sure and capable as ever. The lamplight carved his face from the shadows, highlighting the quiet strength in his jaw, the deep, thoughtful concentration in his eyes. He was no longer a mystery to her, no longer a silent, intimidating figure. He was a man who had walked through hell and had come back with his heart, though scarred, still intact. He was a man who knew the true cost of a loaf of bread, the true weight of a gold ring. He looked up, as if sensing her gaze, and a small, tired smile touched his lips. It was a real smile, a smile that reached all the way to his storm-gray eyes. In that quiet, shared moment, Martha felt a sense of peace so deep and profound it felt like coming home. The store was quiet, the town was asleep, and the desert outside was a vast, dark sea. But here, in the warm, steady light, with this quiet, good man, she was safe, she was found. The store was quiet. It was that time in the late afternoon when the heat of the day finally began to lose its grip, and the shadows stretched long and thin across the dusty street. A soft, golden light filtered through the front windows, illuminating the motes of dust that danced in the still air. Martha stood behind the counter, her hands resting on the smooth, worn wood. From this vantage point, she could see the whole of her small world, the neatly stacked shelves, the quiet reading corner, and through the window, the slow, unhurried life of Copper Bend. She watched as Eli, his bad shoulder still a little stiff, showed young Thomas, one of the orphans from the church, the proper way to hold a saw. He was not just showing him, he was explaining. His voice too low for her to hear the words, but the cadence was patient, the gestures of his good hand clear and instructive. There was a stillness in him, a core of quiet competence that seemed to flow outward, calming the restless energy of the boy. Thomas, who was usually a bundle of fidgets and nerves, was utterly focused, his eyes fixed on Eli's hands, his brow furrowed in concentration. A few months ago, the sight of that quiet, formidable man would have filled her with a mixture of fear and resentment. He had been an enigma, a force that had entered her life and overturned it, his motives as hidden and unreadable as the gray depths of his eyes. She had seen him as her jailer, the architect of her public humiliation. Now, watching him, a profound and gentle warmth spread through her chest. She no longer saw an enigma. She saw a man, painstakingly rebuilding a life from the wreckage of his past. One kind word, one patient lesson at a time. Her own transformation felt just as profound. She thought of the woman she had been, the woman who had walked into McCall's store clutching a ring, her stomach a hollow, aching void. Her pride the only thing holding her upright. That woman had been a victim, adrift on a sea of circumstance, her life defined by what she had lost. She had been so consumed by her own shame, so terrified of being seen as an object of pity, that she had been blind to the truth. She had measured her worth by her independence, by her ability to stand alone against the world. The woman who stood behind the counter now understood that true strength was not about standing alone. It was about having the courage to stand with someone. It was about daring to protect, daring to trust, daring to love. The turning point had not been when Eli bought the store, or even when he offered her a job. It had been the moment she had lifted that shotgun, the heavy, unfamiliar weight of it in her hands, and had chosen to fight. In that instant, the shame had been burned away, replaced by a fierce, protective clarity. She had stopped being a victim and had become a defender. She had found her own agency, not in solitary defiance, but in the shared, desperate struggle for survival and dignity. Eli was learning a similar lesson. Though his journey had been a different one, his prison had not been poverty, but silence. He had lived for years behind a wall of his own making, a fortress built of guilt and grief. The war had taken his wife, but it had also stolen his voice, leaving him with a conviction that words were useless, that they could not save the people you loved. He had believed only in action, in the stark, simple language of doing. He had tried to save her with a parcel of food, with a roof over her head, with a job. But he had not been able to give her the one thing she had needed most the words that would have explained his heart. Now, he was learning to speak again. It was not a sudden flood, but a slow, hesitant spring thaw. It was in the quiet humor of his teasing, in the simple, direct questions he asked about her day, in the patient instructions he gave to the orphan boys. Each word was an act of faith, a small step out of the silent prison of his past. He was learning to trust that connection did not have to end in pain, that offering a piece of himself through language would not inevitably lead to loss. He was learning to believe that some things, some people, were worth the risk of speaking aloud. In the aftermath of the violence, the town had held its breath, waiting to see what would happen. The law had done its part. Silas Crane and his men had been taken by the federal marshal to a prison in Prescott, their brand of casual cruelty removed from the streets of Copper Bend. Silas had been the embodiment of the town's worst instincts. He was the voice of the sneering gossip, the personification of the idea that a human being could be appraised, bought, and discarded like a piece of a livestock. He saw the world as a hierarchy of power, where the strong took what they wanted and the weak were objects of contempt. His defeat had been more than a legal victory. It had been a moral one. When Martha had stood with that shotgun and declared her own worth, she had spoken for a different kind of justice, one that did not come from a judge's gavel, but from the simple, unshakable courage of the human heart. And the town, to her surprise, had listened. They had been the silent chorus to her tragedy, their whispers and judgments the backdrop to her humiliation. But in the face of real violence, of a child being shot and a good man being struck down, their small-mindedness had fallen away, replaced by a deeper, more essential instinct for community. Mrs. Miller's pot of soup, the miners with their brooms, the steady, unwavering support of Dr. Hemlock. These were the signs of a society healing itself, in a place where a sudden storm, a snake bite, or a season of drought could mean the difference between life and death. They had been reminded of the most fundamental law of the desert: you survive together, or you die alone. Their growing love, hers and Eli's, was built on this bedrock of shared survival. It was a mature and quiet thing, a love that had come not in the first flush of youth, but after a long and difficult education in the realities of loss. The true foundation of their bond was the silent acknowledgement of each other's wounds. She understood now that his every action was shadowed by the ghost of a young woman who had starved to death before his helpless eyes. His quiet insistence that she eat, his fierce need to provide a sanctuary, was a long, desperate apology to a memory. And he, in turn, had seen the wounds she carried. He had seen her pride, the fragile shield she used to protect herself from the shame of her poverty and the pain of her grief. His clumsy, extravagant act of buying the store had been his way of honoring that pride. He had not offered her a handout that would have confirmed her status as a victim. He had offered her a fortress where she could regain her footing, a place where her dignity would be secure. True love, she was learning, was not about finding a person without scars. It was about recognizing the scars on another's soul and loving them not in spite of them, but because of them. It was the acceptance of the whole person, the broken pieces and all. The central, unifying theme of their story was a single, simple word: stay. It was what he had said to her on that first, confusing day, a plea that was as much for his own soul as it was for hers. It was an appeal to every wounded, wandering spirit to not give up, to not flee, to remain and endure. It was an act of profound humanity, the recognition that every person, no matter how broken or lost, deserved a place to be, a reason to keep going. She had almost rejected that plea, had almost run away in the name of a pride that had more to do with fear than with strength. But she had come back. She had chosen to stay, and in staying, she had not only saved him, but she had saved herself. As the last of the sunlight faded from the store, Eli finished his work and came inside, brushing the sawdust from his hands. He walked over to the counter and stood before her, the easy, comfortable silence of their evening settling around them. "Thomas is getting good with that saw," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble in the quiet. "He has a good teacher," she replied, a soft smile on her face. He looked at her, his gray eyes clear and steady in the lamplight. "We both do." In that moment, she saw the truth of their journey with a sudden, startling clarity. They had not fundamentally changed. He had always been a good and compassionate man. The war had just buried it under layers of guilt and silence. She had always been a strong and resilient woman. Grief and poverty had just bent her low. Their time together had not been a process of transformation, but one of excavation. They had, with painstaking effort, helped each other clear away the debris of their pasts. They had helped each other rediscover the essential, unbreakable core of their own humanity, the part of themselves they had thought was lost forever. And in finding themselves, they had, at last, truly found each other. The quiet hum of the evening store was a world away from the clamor of its own past. It was a peace so profound, so deeply settled, that it sometimes felt like a dream. Martha watched Eli from across the counter as he carefully measured a length of rope for a rancher, his movements economical and sure. The lamplight softened the hard lines of his face, revealing a gentleness that the harsh desert sun often concealed. It was in these quiet moments that the full, staggering scope of their journey would wash over her, a series of seismic shocks that had realigned the very foundations of her world. The first tremor had been an act of seeming madness. When she thought back to the day Eli Turner had bought the store, the memory still carried a phantom sting of humiliation. To the town. It had been the grand, foolish gesture of a lovesick cowboy, a man who had lost his senses and spent a fortune on a whim. She herself had seen it as a cruel and elaborate form of charity, a public branding of her poverty. For weeks, that single inexplicable act had defined them, casting him as the silent fool and her as the bewitching pauper who had driven him to it. But now, with the clarity of hindsight, she saw the truth. It had not been madness. It had been a desperate, silent prayer. It was an act of profound and painful humanity, a man flinging the entirety of his worldly possessions into a breach opened by a memory. He was not buying a store. He was building a wall against the encroaching ghosts of his past, a fortress where no woman would ever have to beg for a loaf of bread again. It was the most selfless act she had ever witnessed, disguised as the most selfish folly. The key that had unlocked this truth, the revelation that had recontextualized every confusing moment, had been delivered in the quiet, somber voice of Dr. Hemlock. She could still feel the stifling air of her small, rented room, could still see the gentle sorrow in the old doctor's eyes as he spoke of a place called Andersonville. The story had fallen upon her not as a narrative, but as a physical weight, a horror that settled deep in her bones. As he spoke of Eli's young wife, Sarah, starving to death just beyond the stockade walls, every confusing piece of the puzzle of Eli Turner had slammed into place. His unnatural stillness, his haunted gray eyes, his profound, unshakable silence, they were not the traits of a simple, uncommunicative cowboy. They were the scars of a man who had been forced to watch the unimaginable, a helpless witness to a slow, brutal murder orchestrated by neglect and cruelty. Suddenly, she understood everything. His frantic $10 purchase of her ring was not about possessing it. It was about silencing the echo of his wife's pleas. His silent offerings of food were not charity. They were a desperate ritual, an attempt to feed a ghost. And his first words to her in the store, the ones that had so confused and angered her, now echoed in her heart with the devastating clarity of a hymn. Keep the gold and stay. He had not been speaking to her pride. He had been speaking to his own deepest terror. He was begging her, and by extension the ghost of his wife, not to leave, not to fade away, not to be lost to the slow, grinding death of hunger. He had been trying to save the woman he had already lost, and in doing so, he had saved the one who stood before him. That understanding had propelled her back to him, a frantic, desperate run fueled by regret and a dawning, terrifying love. and it had led her directly into the story's most violent, pivotal twist. She had expected to find him, to apologize, to try and mend the bridge she had so carelessly burned. Instead, she had found him surrounded, outnumbered. A lone man absorbing the brutish violence of Silas Crane and his men. The sight of him, backed against the shelves, refusing to truly fight back, had ignited something in her she had not known she possessed. The world had seen her as a victim, a poor widow dependent on the kindness of others. But in that moment, as she darted behind the counter and her hands closed around the heavy stock of the shotgun, that version of her had died forever. She had not been the one who needed saving. She had become the savior. The blast of the gun, a deafening roar of defiance, had been her own declaration of independence, a statement more powerful than any words she could have spoken. It was a complete and stunning reversal of their roles. She, the damsel in distress, had become the protector. He, the silent, powerful benefactor, had become the one in need of her strength. The chaos that followed was a trial by fire. The air, thick with flour dust and the acrid smell of gunpowder, had been a canvas for their love story's most brutal and honest chapter. There had been no soft words, no gentle courtship. Their bond had been forged in the crucible of violence, tested by the whistle of lead and the stark, terrifying reality of spilled blood. She could still feel the visceral shock that had coursed through her as she saw the bullet strike his shoulder, the red stain spreading across his shirt like a fatal bloom. In that moment of pure terror, the fear of losing him had eclipsed everything else. It was a feeling so powerful, so absolute, that it had given her a strange and terrible calm. Their true vows had not been spoken in a church, but whispered behind a barricade of oak and spilled sugar. His ragged plea, "If I fall, do not sell that ring again," had been his last will and testament, a final, desperate act of protection. And her reply, "I would sell my life first," had been her unbreakable oath. It was a love that had found its voice not in professions of affection, but in desperate actions taken at the precipice of death. It was a love that had been proven not by what they said, but by what they were willing to do for each other when everything was on the line. And then, in the aftermath, had come the quietest and perhaps most significant miracle of all. His voice, after the long, fevered silence of his recovery. The first scratchy, hesitant word had been more startling than a gunshot. The slow return of his speech was a symbol of his own resurrection. It was the sound of a man clawing his way back not just from a physical wound, but from a spiritual one that was decades old. Each new word he spoke was a testament to a newfound trust. It was a trust in her, a trust that she would not vanish, a trust that he could open the door to his silent, guarded heart without the world rushing in to destroy it. His voice, now a low, warm rumble in the quiet of their evenings, was the sound of a life being reclaimed, the sound of hope finding its tongue. The town of Copper Bend had been the audience for this entire, improbable drama. They had witnessed every act, every twist. They had seen the proud woman brought low by hunger. They had seen the silent cowboy's seemingly insane act of devotion. They had seen the brutal violence of Silas Crane, and they had seen the small, determined woman rise up to meet it. They had watched her nurse him back from the brink, and they had watched the two of them, side by side, rebuild the store and, in doing so, help to rebuild the heart of the town itself. The gossip had died, shamed into silence by the undeniable truth of their courage and commitment. In its place, a small legend had begun to grow. It was the story of the quiet cowboy and the widow he had saved, and how, in the end, she had saved him right back. Martha looked across the counter at Eli, and a feeling of profound gratitude settled over her. The path they had walked had been paved with pain, fear, and misunderstanding. She had almost taken the easier road. The night she had left him, walking away into the darkness, had been an act of escape. It had felt brave at the time, a solitary stand for her own dignity. But she knew now that it had been the coward's way out. The true test of courage had been the act of coming back. It was harder to stay, harder to face the wounds of the past, harder to learn to trust, harder to forgive both him and herself. But in choosing the harder path, in choosing to stay, she had found not just a life, but a home. A year passed. The seasons in the Arizona Territory did not so much turn as they shifted their tactics. The relentless siege of summer gave way to the crisp, clear campaigns of autumn, which in turn yielded to the sharp, biting raids of winter. This year, for the first time in a long time, winter had come in earnest. A soft, white blanket of snow had fallen overnight, a rare and startling miracle that transformed the familiar red dust of Copper Bend into a landscape of pristine, quiet beauty. The air was cold and clean, and the smoke that rose from the town's chimneys went straight up into a sky the color of pale, flawless turquoise. Every evening, without fail, a warm, steady light shone from the windows of Turner's store. It had become a landmark, a beacon of constancy in a world that was anything but. The store was the town's anchor. It had weathered the seasons, both of the climate and of the human heart, and it stood now as a testament to the quiet, stubborn power of endurance. Inside, the shelves were always stocked, the floor was always swept, and a fire always crackled in the pot-bellied stove, its warmth a welcome embrace against the winter chill. And on the counter, near the register, sat a small, unadorned glass jar. Inside it, resting on a bed of dark velvet, was a simple, worn gold ring. It was not for sale. Everyone in town knew its story, or at least they knew the legend of it. It was a kind of public relic, a silent reminder of the day the silent cowboy had bought a store and a town's worth of gossip, and of the day the quiet widow had stood her ground with a shotgun in her hands. It was a symbol, though no one ever said it aloud, of the fact that the most valuable things in this hard country could never be measured in gold. The last of the daylight was fading, painting the snow outside in shades of lavender and rose. Martha was in the reading corner, carefully placing a few books back on their small shelf. Two children, the Miller twins, lingered by the stove, soaking up the last of the warmth before their walk home. They were watching her with the solemn, curious eyes of the young. "Time to go, you two," she said, her voice soft. "Your mother will be worrying." She went behind the counter and took 2 freshly baked biscuits from a covered tin, wrapping them each in a small piece of waxed paper. She handed one to each child. "For the walk," she said with a smile. The little girl, whose name was Emily, looked down at the biscuit in her mitten, then back up at Martha. "My PA says you are the luckiest woman in the territory," she said, her voice a serious, piping whisper. Martha's smile did not falter. She knelt down so she was at eye level with the children. "Luck is a funny thing. Emily," she said gently, "sometimes what looks like luck is just a lot of hard work and a little bit of kindness when you need it most." She looked from the girl to her brother, her gaze full of a quiet, earnest intensity. "I want you to remember something," she said, her voice dropping a little. "There may be times in your life when you feel hungry, or when you feel like you do not have enough. There may even be people who try to make you feel small because of it." She paused, the memory of her own gnawing hunger a faint, distant echo. "But you listen to me. Do not ever let anyone tell you that you do not deserve to be full. You deserve to have a full belly and a full heart and a life full of goodness. You are worthy of it. Always. Do you understand?" The children nodded, their eyes wide, taking in her words with the profound seriousness that only the very young can muster. She gave them each a gentle pat on the shoulder, and they turned and scurried out the door, the bell above it giving a cheerful, tinkling jingle that sounded like sleigh bells in the cold, still air. She stood up, a feeling of deep, quiet contentment settling over her. She watched the children's small, dark shapes recede into the blue twilight, and she felt a sense of peace that was as pure and complete as the new fallen snow. The bell on the door jingled again, this time with a more solid, deliberate sound. Eli stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold, clean air with him. He was a silhouette against the fading light, broad-shouldered and solid. He carefully stomped the snow from his boots on the mat, then closed the door, shutting out the winter. He took off his hat, revealing the familiar thatch of dark hair, and ran a hand through it. There was a dusting of white on the shoulders of his heavy sheepskin coat. He walked over to the counter, his steps sure and familiar on the wooden floorboards. In his hand, he held a small, rustic bouquet. It was made of dried desert flowers, the hardy, beautiful things that bloomed in the most unlikely of places, the pale, ghostly white of the evening primrose, the deep purple of the verbena, and the cheerful, defiant yellow of the brittle bush. They were flowers of survival, beautiful in their resilience. He placed them gently on the counter beside the glass jar with the ring. He looked at her, and his gray eyes, which had once been so guarded and full of storm clouds, were clear and warm in the lamplight. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile she had come to know and cherish, a smile that transformed his entire countenance from one of stoic reserve to one of open, unguarded affection. His voice, when he spoke, was the low, warm rumble that was now the most comforting sound in her world. Stores closed. Mrs. Turner. The name, spoken aloud for the first time, hung in the warm air between them. It was not a question, not a presumption, but a simple statement of fact, as natural and as right as the fire in the stove. A happy, bubbling warmth rose in her chest, and she felt a blush creep into her cheeks. She tilted her head, a playful, teasing light dancing in her own eyes. "Then what are you buying, Mr. Turner?" she asked, her voice a soft, happy murmur. He chuckled, a low, easy sound. He leaned his arms on the counter, bringing his face a little closer to hers. The scent of cold air and wood smoke clung to him. "Nothing left to buy," he said, his eyes holding hers. "I already bought the store." The words were a direct echo of their past, a shared memory that had once been a source of shame and misunderstanding. Now, it was the foundation of their life, a piece of their private lore, a joke they alone could share. He held her gaze for a long moment, and in the quiet of the store, something shifted. The playful mood deepened into something more profound, more significant. With a slow, deliberate movement, he walked around the end of the counter to stand beside her. He took her hand, his calloused palm warm and strong around her own. He led her to the center of the room, to a spot where the light from the main lantern fell in a soft, golden pool. He did not let go of her hand. "Martha," he began, his voice a little thicker than before, "I have not done this right, any of it. I came into your life like a storm, and I never gave you a choice. I just did things. The way I knew how, the only way I knew how." He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. "I have been learning to talk," he said, a small, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. "You taught me, but I still do not have the fancy words. All I have are the plain ones." And then, to her utter astonishment, he slowly, gracefully, went down on one knee. He did it without any theatrical flourish, with a simple, solemn dignity that took her breath away. He knelt before her on the floor of the store they had built together, his upturned face full of a love so deep and so true it made her heart ache with happiness. He reached up with his free hand and carefully, reverently, lifted the small glass jar from the counter. He unscrewed the lid and tipped the jar, letting the gold ring slide into his palm. "I was a fool," he said, his voice a low, earnest whisper. "I tried to give you this ring to save myself. Now I want to give it to you to save the rest of my life." He held it out to her, the simple gold band gleaming in the center of his palm. "I never asked you proper. I never asked you at all." He looked directly into her eyes, and in their gray depths she saw his entire history, the sorrow of his past and the bright, steady hope for their future. "Martha Green," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Will you keep it this time?" Tears welled in her eyes, hot and happy. They traced silent paths down her cheeks, but she was smiling. A smile so wide and so bright it felt as if her whole soul was lit from within. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment, the joy too large for words. She found her voice, and it was a choked, happy whisper. She took his own words, the ones that had once been a riddle and had become their covenant, and she gave them back to him as her answer. "Keep the gold and stay." He let out a shaky breath, a sound of profound relief and joy. He took the ring and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He rose to his feet and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. He buried his face in her hair, and she could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart against her own. He whispered one last word into her ear, a simple, final promise that sealed their past and opened the door to all of their tomorrows. Forever. Outside, a cold wind swept across the vast, sleeping desert, stirring the new fallen snow into glittering, ghostly eddies. But inside the store, all was warmth and light. A single steady flame shone from the window of Turner's store, a small but defiant beacon against the immense and wild darkness. It was a light that cast its hopeful glow out onto the lonely dirt road, a symbol of faith, of life, and of a love that had not only survived, but had triumphed over poverty, prejudice, and the long, silent ghosts of the past. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.